Hello and welcome to Spill the Tea. True Stories, the place where real life is more fascinating than fiction. Sit back, pour yourself a cup of tea, and let's dive into the moments that stay with us forever. We're starting now. A little boy sat on a bench watching the passers-by. There were many of them here. Some strolled leisurely through the green space, others hurried somewhere. A motley, colorful crowd moved around him. There were children in the park too, big ones and ones his size. These were held tightly by the hands of adults, mothers and fathers, grandmothers and grandfathers. Alex had also come to the park with Eleanor. Before this, they had traveled for a very long time on a train. For Alex, it was the first trip of this kind. He had never before seen such huge, steaming iron machines that smelled so strange, yet pleasant. At the station, he had even been scared, not being used to it. "What are you, a sissy?" Frank sneered, noticing how Alex flinched away from the train. "Your mother said she gave birth to a boy." Alex couldn't stand Frank, this loud, perpetually unshaven, angry man. But Eleanor, it seemed, loved him. She hugged him, kissed him, stroked his head, and tried to please him in everything. Alex didn't understand what could be found pleasant in this man. He found him rude and unpleasant, unlike the gentle touch of Eleanor's hand. When Frank first appeared in their small apartment, Alex even liked him at first. He came with a cake, candies, juice, and flowers for Eleanor. It felt like a holiday, and Alex loved holidays. Frank stayed to live with them in their small dwelling with creaky floors and wide windowsills. Alex adored his home. So old, so familiar, wooden, two-story, with neighbors who were always kind to him. He didn't understand why the adults called this place an old barracks, and complained that it was long overdue for demolition. "Why? Where? It's wonderful here. This is the best place in the world," he once declared to Mrs. Gable, the old neighbor who often talked to the curious little boy and treated him to something tasty. She laughed so hard that tears came to her eyes, and then for some reason she grew sad and hugged Alex tightly. Mrs. Gable was good, very kind. Alex missed her on this trip, although he did enjoy his first adventure in life. Mrs. Gable didn't like Frank either. She called him a tyrant, a drunkard, and a worthless man. Alex didn't know exactly what all these words meant, but by the way Mrs. Gable pronounced them, he understood. It was something very bad, and he agreed with her. When Frank appeared in their apartment, Eleanor's former friends stopped visiting. And this was good, because they would sit in the kitchen all night long, laughing, making noise, often arguing, and even fighting. At such moments, Alex would hide under the bed, afraid he might get hurt. It was scary and unpleasant. Frank drove everyone away, and peace reigned in the house. But, unfortunately, not for long. Frank turned out to be much worse than Eleanor's friends. He swore at Eleanor and Alex, was constantly dissatisfied with something, demanding complete obedience. And then people started coming to the apartment again. Only now they were Frank's friends, just as gloomy and angry as he was, and Alex was very afraid of them. Sometimes Frank would kick Alex out of the apartment saying, "Go for a walk, you're annoying," and locking the door. Alex tried to explain that it was cold or raining outside, that he would sit quietly like a mouse in his room and wouldn't bother anyone. But Frank was adamant, and Eleanor agreed with him in everything. So Alex would wander around the deserted yard for hours. It was good if Mrs. Gable met him and took him in. Mrs. Gable's apartment was clean. It always smelled delicious. And although Alex loved his home, looking at Mrs. Gable's bright rooms, Alex understood. Their apartment was constantly in chaos. Mrs. Gable didn't have empty bottles lying around in the corners, and there was no dust, dirt, or trash on the floor. Along the walls stood cabinets with books. Alex loved looking at the pictures in them. Mrs. Gable even started teaching him to read. Progress was fast. Alex was already putting letters together into words. It was like magic. Incomprehensible scribbles suddenly acquired concrete meaning. But the learning process had to be interrupted. "We're leaving here tomorrow," Eleanor announced one day. "I've already packed." "Well, there's not much to pack," Frank rasped from the next room. "Where are we going?" Alex asked. "To a better life," Eleanor answered vaguely. "Somewhere everything will be completely different." That night, Alex couldn't fall asleep. Excitement kept him awake. So many thoughts crowded in his little head, anticipation of a miracle settled in his heart. Something special would happen soon, something completely new. The unknown was a little frightening, but the changes were still joyful. In the morning, it was hard to wake Alex up. "Get up fast, or we'll leave and you'll stay here," Frank barked, watching Eleanor's unsuccessful attempts to lift her sleepy son from the sofa. Alex immediately jumped up. He understood. Frank wasn't joking or trying to scare him. He really could do that. He was capable of it. The station greeted Alex with a colorful, inviting crowd of people. Alex held tightly onto Eleanor's hand, although her hands were full with bags. Alex was very afraid of getting lost in this vast sea of people. And then they went out onto the platform, and a train appeared before Alex's astonished eyes. Huge, steaming, bright, and menacingly puffing like a hot iron. Mrs. Gable! Alex was seeing a real locomotive for the first time. No, of course, there were pictures of trains in Mrs. Gable's books, but an illustration was one thing, and seeing such a behemoth in real life was another. The train was both frightening and fascinating at the same time. "What are you gaping at like an idiot?" Frank roughly nudged the stunned Alex. "Let's go," Eleanor agreed, and moved towards the train. Inside was even better than Alex had imagined. Frank and Eleanor settled down on the lower bunks, and Alex was put on the upper bunk. From there it was very comfortable and interesting to watch the life of the carriage. And what views opened up from the window. Alex even fell silent for several hours, which didn't happen often with him. Forests, fields, and villages sped past. The world, it turned out, was so huge, so beautiful. How he wished he could walk in those groves, throw stones into the rivers and lakes flashing past the window. And sometimes oncoming trains passed on neighboring tracks, passenger and freight. The most interesting were those carrying equipment. Alex liked the clatter of the wheels. It was soothing and promised adventures and joyful meetings. When it got dark outside and Eleanor told her son to go to bed, Alex lay and listened to this rhythmic sound. It lulled Alex to sleep, tired from new impressions. In the morning, Alex was woken by the long whistle of the train. Alex didn't even understand at first where he was and was a little scared. Then he remembered everything, smiled, hung his head down, made sure Eleanor and Frank were sleeping nearby on the lower bunks, calmed down, and stared out the window again. The train was speeding through an unusually picturesque hilly area. The landscapes were captivating, making his tiny heart swell with delight. Alex suddenly felt a strong desire to take an album and pencils and try to draw this beauty. Only he didn't have an album or pencils. All that was left with Mrs. Gable. It was she who gave him such things, while Eleanor and Frank thought that children shouldn't be spoiled and that a 4-year-old couldn't draw anyway. After some time, the adults woke up. All three had a leisurely snack of bread and sausage and drank tea from glasses in silver cup holders. It was very tasty, and then Alex was ordered to climb back onto the upper bunk. "And stay quiet there," Frank warned, "or they'll notice you and kick you off. You don't have a ticket, you're riding free." Alex was scared by these words and obediently took his place. He liked the upper bunk, but Alex's legs were already stiff. He really wanted to walk around the carriage, see who else was traveling in it, get to know someone, maybe even run a little in the narrow corridor. But Frank made it clear he couldn't. And if he didn't obey him, Alex didn't even want to imagine what the consequences would be. After some time, the train stopped. Alex looked out the window. They were at a crowded station. They had probably arrived in some big city. "Let's take a walk," Eleanor suddenly suggested. "Let's stretch our legs a bit. The stop is long, we have time. We'll get some fresh air." "Just the perfect spot," Frank approved. Alex was very happy. Finally, he would go outside. He wondered what city this was. What were the people like? What were the streets like? Now everything would become clear. It was good that Frank wasn't going with them. Alex liked walking with Eleanor, just the two of them, but lately, that hadn't happened often. And now, unexpected joy. At the station, Eleanor bought Alex a tasty pastry with jam. Alex walked, holding tightly onto her hand, and looked around with curiosity. What a nice place. Passers-by smiled at the wide-eyed little boy. The sun was shining brightly from the sky. Sparrows were chirping. "Oh, if only we could stay here forever," Alex said dreamily. Eleanor smiled somehow strangely. Then they came to the park. There were so many interesting swings, so many wonderful slides. In his town, Alex had never seen such splendor. "Can I?" he asked Eleanor, looking at the bright playground. "Of course," Eleanor nodded. She sat on a bench opposite and waved her hand, as if to say, Go and have fun. I'll wait for you here." Alex rushed to the playground as fast as he could. He rode on carousels and swings, went through rope mazes, jumped on a trampoline. His delight was boundless. How happy he was that he and Eleanor had come for a walk in this wonderful city. There were many children around. They laughed and had fun, chasing each other. Alex joined first one group, then another. Nobody chased him away. On the contrary, they were happy when Alex joined. Well, that was right. The more people, the merrier. Finally, Alex felt very tired and missed Eleanor. He was also hungry. He wondered how long he had spent on the wonderful playground and why he hadn't been called yet. It was time to go back. Alex ran towards the bench where Eleanor had been sitting. But the bench was empty. On the next bench sat two old women, comfortably watching their grandchildren. On the next one, a man with a stroller. There were no more benches near the playground. And Eleanor wasn't there either. How could this be? Where was Eleanor? What happened to her? Maybe she just went to buy water or a pastry and would be back soon, and she would even laugh at Alex for being such a scaredy cat, as long as she didn't tell Frank, or he would tease him about being a sissy again. Alex settled down next to the old women, who paid no attention to him, so engrossed were they in conversation. Eleanor had been sitting on this very bench, the one next to theirs, so she would come back here. How else? Time passed. The old women called their grandchildren and left. The other benches also emptied. There were almost no children left on the playground. It was getting dark. And Alex just sat there as if glued, waiting for Eleanor. He was cold and hungry, and he was very scared. Adults hurried past on their business. Alex tried to spot a familiar, such a dear face in the crowd. But deep down, the little one began to understand. Eleanor wasn't coming. Something terrible had happened, something incredible. Maybe Eleanor was missing. Or that evil man came and took her away and ordered Alex to stay here. Eleanor always obeyed him, after all. What should he do? So scared, so cold, so lonely. And the people no longer seemed as friendly as they had in the morning, and the sun no longer shone so brightly and welcomingly. Even the playground didn't bring joy. Look, all the swings were free now. Sit on whichever one you want. You don't even have to wait in line. But he didn't want to at all. And suddenly, Alex caught sight of something familiar in the crowd. No, it wasn't Eleanor. An elderly woman was walking slowly along the road, very much like Mrs. Gable. Not so much in appearance, but in her expression, gait, and mannerisms. For some reason, tears welled up in Alex's eyes right now. This woman couldn't be evil. She, like Mrs. Gable, would help him in a difficult moment, tell him what to do next, support him, comfort him. Alex jumped off the bench, ran up to the stranger with the kind face. He couldn't delay. What if she walked past now and got lost in the crowd? "Hello, Auntie," Alex said first. Mrs. Gable always said that politeness gets you everywhere, and told her little neighbor about the importance of good manners. "Well, hello, little one." The woman looked surprised but very kindly. Her eyes were as blue and radiant as Mrs. Gable's. This discovery gave Alex confidence. "By any chance, do you know where my mother is? I'm very cold now and I'm hungry too, and she's still not here." A flicker of anxiety crossed the woman's face. She knelt down in front of Alex so that their eyes were at the same level. "Little one, are you lost?" "I don't know, honestly," Alex replied. "But I think it's not me who's lost, but Mom. I stayed where she left me, but she's nowhere to be found." The woman had lingered at the polyclinic. Her blood pressure had been fluctuating lately, so she had to visit periodically. "Age, what did you expect?" the district doctor would say, shrugging, and prescribe more medications and tests. Age. Yes, she wasn't a girl anymore. It had been a whole year since she retired. She could hardly believe it. Eleanor had worked as a seamstress all her life. She had worked at a large factory in several shifts, slaved away at private enterprises, and done orders at home. The very difficult times when there was barely enough money for bread were in the past. Eleanor still remembered the despair of those days. It was then that the incident occurred for which she blamed herself her whole life. Sometimes it seemed that her conscience was at peace, that she had managed to convince herself that there was no other way. But then the guilt returned and pressed down with new force. Outwardly, Eleanor remained calm and even cheerful. No one suspected what heavy thoughts were churning in her head. She and George rarely recalled what had happened. Eleanor suspected that he also suffered deeply inside. At least, hidden sadness was often visible in her husband's eyes. Of course, it was impossible to forget something like that. Those were the difficult 90s. Eleanor was constantly at work, working 2 shifts. She came home in the evenings tired and exhausted. The legs, back, and arms of the young woman literally ached from fatigue and overexertion. Her eyes teared up. They paid mere pennies for this work, and even those were regularly delayed, citing the difficult economic situation. "No one is keeping you here," the director replied to all who were dissatisfied. "If you don't want to work, write a resignation letter. There's a queue for your position, rest assured." And it was true. Enterprises were collapsing one after another. People were left without means of subsistence. Eleanor understood that she wouldn't find work in the city and therefore endured. She worked overtime, came in on weekends, she came home squeezed dry like a lemon. And in the small apartment they rented with George from a very principled old woman, their 2-year-old daughter, Sophia, was waiting for them. George usually managed to pick up the little girl by the time Eleanor returned. George had recently lost his job. The promising engineer now did odd jobs in the evenings. Sometimes he drove a taxi, sometimes he unloaded trucks, sometimes he helped at construction sites. He hadn't been laid off, but finding a new place proved to be quite difficult. George had even given up on his qualifications, looking for an electrician vacancy. His education allowed him to work in this field, but times were such. Work was hard to find, so he scraped by on odd jobs. The young couple's parents couldn't help the family. They were barely surviving themselves, and they were elderly already. Both Eleanor and George were late children in their families. The situation was more than desperate. But Eleanor remembered those times even with a certain nostalgia. She and George were young and loved each other very much. Back then, it seemed that everything would settle down, that financial difficulties wouldn't last forever. Their beloved daughter, Sophia, was nearby, delighting them every day with new achievements. And most importantly, they hadn't yet committed the act for which they now felt guilty. Their conscience was absolutely clear, which is why life was easier and calmer then, despite the financial troubles. Eleanor clearly remembered the day she found out she was pregnant again. She hadn't been feeling well lately. At first, she dismissed the alarming symptoms, attributing them to lack of sleep, nerves, and poor nutrition. But then she went to the doctor after work anyway. "You're pregnant," the doctor delivered the verdict after the examination. "And you're already 13 weeks along. It's strange you didn't notice sooner. It's not your first time." Eleanor sat as if struck by lightning. Of course she understood that something was wrong with her body, but she attributed it to stress and hard work. Eleanor, without hesitation, wanted to immediately schedule a termination. She remembered perfectly how happy she had been about the news of her first pregnancy. Now Eleanor felt only fear. She clearly realized that their family, on the verge of survival, couldn't handle another baby. Somewhere deep down, Eleanor really wanted to be a mother again, to experience that wonderful feeling again. But now it was impossible. "Termination? What termination?" the doctor asked tiredly, irritation visible on his face. "Did you hear the term I gave? It's too late. You'll have to give birth." Eleanor barely made it home. Tiny hammers pounded in her temples, stinging tears welled up in her eyes. Various feelings battled within her soul, from joy, strangely enough, to despair. And also thoughts. They danced some crazy dance in Eleanor's head. Her subconscious frantically searched for a way out of the situation. Find a healer who would help get rid of the fetus? That was scary. That was dangerous. Try working from home to support the growing family? Unreliable, problematic with a big belly, and then with 2 babies in the house. Eleanor was so absorbed in her thoughts that she started crossing the road on a red light. An indignant car horn brought her to her senses. She needed to compose herself, share the news with George. He was a man, let him decide. Eleanor clearly remembered the look of fear and despair that appeared on her husband's face when he learned about the pregnancy. She probably looked the same herself at the doctor's office. "Well," George said uncertainly, "since it happened, we'll give birth. What can you do?" "I think I've found work in a workshop." "But what kind of workshop?" "Just a guy in a garage reupholstering furniture. Plus, I'll work nights. We'll manage somehow, since it happened." George hugged Eleanor, trying to cheer her up. And then he got ready and slipped out of the house. A freight train was arriving at the station today. They needed loaders. Eleanor felt a sharp pity for George. A wonderful specialist, an outstanding mind. He was invaluable at his research institute. So many awards, so much respect. And now, a loader and an apprentice. It was a pity. And this child. Because of him, Alex, they, Eleanor and George, would both have to work even harder. But then their little daughter, Sophia, whimpered on the floor. Usually, she could play with her toys for a long time, and suddenly tears. Eleanor touched her forehead. It was hot. And Eleanor took care of Sophia. All other thoughts and problems receded for a while. This second, unwanted pregnancy, with Alex, was very difficult. Eleanor often felt unwell. She was nauseous, dizzy, dark spots flickered before her eyes. All this, of course, affected her work. Firing a pregnant woman isn't easy, but the director made her write a resignation letter. "I don't need workers like you, constant sick leave, not meeting quotas. If you don't resign voluntarily, I'll fire you for professional incompetence, and then you won't find work anywhere with such a black mark." There was even less money. George, of course, tried very hard. He worked in the furniture reupholstery workshop, took on any odd job. But it wasn't enough to live on. And now a baby would appear soon. Eleanor felt nothing for the infant, Alex, who was moving under her heart. She had waited for Sophia with love and joy, talked to her, sung her songs. But she considered the younger child, Alex, a burden, determined to ruin their lives. She scolded herself for such thoughts but couldn't help it. And only just before giving birth, when it was time to prepare the infant's layette, Eleanor softened a little, because she was sure she was expecting a son this time. And so, She sewed him several wonderful blue suits and rompers, stitched diapers with airplanes. Looking at all these tiny things, Eleanor felt some warm feelings for the belly dweller, Alex, for the first time. That's what George jokingly called the baby. He was looking forward to his arrival, making plans, even managing to be happy, although he was very tired from his jobs. Alex was born on a stormy November night. In between painful contractions, Eleanor heard the wind beating against the windows and the cold rain drumming. Finally, a wrinkled, crying red creature was placed on the exhausted woman's chest. "A boy," the midwife said indifferently and hurried to another woman in labor. Eleanor looked at her son and couldn't understand her feelings. She expected that upon seeing the little one, she would be filled with tenderness towards him, as it had been the first time. But now Eleanor only thought about how to feed and raise this extra mouth. The baby was taken away. She was sent to the ward. Eleanor fell into a deep sleep with pleasure. She was very tired, both physically and emotionally. And in the morning, sad news awaited her. After the babies were brought for feeding and taken away, the doctor came into the ward. She said a few words to each mother about their babies, but asked Eleanor to come to her office in half an hour. Eleanor froze. She understood that something was wrong with her child. Otherwise, why such special attention? At the appointed time, Eleanor, on stiff legs, entered Ms. Albright's office. "Please sit down." Ms. Albright smiled tiredly, gesturing towards the chair in front of the desk. "It turns out the newborn boy has serious heart and kidney problems. He needs treatment, lifelong treatment. There are medications, but they are expensive." "We have absolutely no money," Eleanor stammered, turning cold. Yes, she hadn't been filled with love at first sight for the newborn, but he was her son. And the news of his illnesses was a cruel blow. And then, expensive medications. Where could they get the money for them if they were barely making ends meet? Ms. Albright started talking about funds that help families in such difficult situations. It turned out there were also sponsors in the city who supported sick children. But they had to ask, collect documents, knock on every door. "There will be a way out. The main thing is the desire," the tired woman in the white coat assured the shocked mother. It was easy for her to say she hadn't given birth to a sick child. And then came the discharge, and a hard life began with a sick newborn, a capricious 3-year-old. All this in conditions of family financial disaster. They decided to name their son Alex, after George's great-grandfather, who had excellent health and lived to almost 100, remaining in his right mind and on his own feet. George believed that the name would help the new child become healthy and strong. Eleanor didn't object. It made no difference. Eleanor herself had no desire to think about a name for the boy. Alex turned out to be very restless. He cried a lot, slept little, ate poorly. Sophia, jealous of Eleanor's attention to the new family member, literally became uncontrollable, constantly whining and demanding attention. Eleanor was going crazy from all this. But the most important thing was the baby's health problems. They were confirmed at the children's polyclinic. It turned out that things were even worse than initially thought. Alex required lifelong therapy with expensive medications. Charitable funds partially paid for the medications, but still, a large part of the family budget now went to treatment. Eleanor understood perfectly that Alex was not to blame for anything, but she still practically hated this tiny tormentor for all the difficulties he brought to their family. Eleanor didn't recognize herself. She had always believed that the defining traits of her personality were kindness, mercy, and compassion. How could a woman who used to not pass a hungry kitten calmly think such things about her sick, tiny son? But you can't command your feelings. It was only later that Eleanor understood and analyzed her state at the time. A difficult pregnancy, the preceding work in several shifts, lack of money, serious diagnoses for the child, lack of help, lack of prospects. All together led to a severe state, and that was very serious and required treatment by a specialist. But who thought about professional psychological support in those difficult times? Survival was the main concern. One way or another, after a year it became clear. The family could no longer cope with a disabled child. Not morally, not financially, not physically. Eleanor was the first to suggest a way out. "We can't cope with him," she said to George one evening, looking him seriously in the eye. "It's obvious that he's getting worse. We can't even buy him medication. We're constantly saving on everything, denying ourselves everything, depriving Sophia, and we still can't cope." "I'm trying." George lowered his eyes. He didn't even argue. It was obvious that Eleanor was telling the truth. "You're trying, I see. You'll break down soon. You're not made of iron. And then we'll be completely lost. This can't go on any longer. Something needs to be done urgently. I think we should put him in a special institution. At least there they'll provide him with medication. I found out that treatment for orphan children is paid for by the state." "To an orphanage? Are you suggesting we give up our son?" George looked at Eleanor with eyes wide with horror. Unlike her, he clearly had warm feelings for Alex. He talked to him, played with him, constantly smiled at the boy, carried him on his back when he had a free moment. Of course, this didn't happen often. Work took up most of his time. "Well, what's the alternative?" Eleanor burst out. "To calmly watch him slowly fade away before our eyes? To spend all our money on a hopeless treatment, depriving Sophia? Should all of us starve? And for his sake?" George didn't say anything then, but Eleanor saw. He was seriously considering her words. George understood intellectually that a severely ill child was indeed beyond their means right now. But deciding on such a desperate step was hard, very hard. Eleanor understood him in this. Alex was already 1 year old. He looked remarkably like his mother. Big blue eyes, light curly hair, a slightly turned-up nose. An incredibly cute child, simply an angel from a postcard, only very thin. Perhaps his appearance would work in his favor, and he would find wealthy parents for whom the amount needed for his treatment was pennies. And he would have a happy, comfortable, long life. But they couldn't manage him themselves, it was obvious. Rental housing, lack of stable work. He wasn't the kind of child you could send to kindergarten at 2 and go back to work from maternity leave. He needed constant attention and supervision. No employer would agree to continuous sick leave. And it was terrifying to think what would happen to Alex without the necessary therapy. They couldn't provide him with adequate treatment. So Eleanor saw only one way out. George initially tried to take control of the situation. He found another odd job, wasn't home for days hoping to provide for the family. But in the end, he also understood that it was time for decisive action. Eleanor remembered perfectly the morning she and George arrived at the orphanage. The special institution was in a neighboring region. They had arranged with Ms. Albright in advance, so the family was expected in the office. They were met by a middle-aged woman with very anxious eyes. Looking at her husband, who was tenderly holding Alex close, she clarified. "Are you absolutely sure? There won't be hysterics, tears, accusations against us later?" "Yes, we have thought it all through. We have no other option," Eleanor answered confidently. She wanted to get the difficult procedure over with quickly. Alex smiled, happy to be going somewhere with Mom and Dad, looking at the woman trustingly. It was unbearable. "All right," Ms. Albright sighed. "The papers are ready. Please review and sign them. The child will be taken now." At these words, the father instinctively held Alex even tighter. Eleanor also reached for the baby, but stopped herself. It was decided. It would be better this way. For them, and for their son. Soon, only the adults were left in the office. Alex was taken by Martha, the nurse. She managed to cast a judgmental look at Eleanor. Eleanor withstood it quite calmly. Anyone who hadn't been in such a situation had no right to blame them for anything. And then life went on. To avoid questions from neighbors, Eleanor and George rented another apartment in a remote area. Eleanor went back to work. Life seemed to become easier. But the thought of the baby left in the orphanage, of course, couldn't help but torment both parents. George and Eleanor tried not to talk about their action, silently stewing in their own feelings. Eleanor every day found many arguments for such a decision. Alex was receiving the necessary treatment. They were raising their elder daughter, Sophia, properly, not depriving her of either attention or material comforts. George wasn't slaving away at several jobs at once. He looked like a person again, not a tormented zombie. It was better for everyone this way. And yet, Eleanor often couldn't sleep at night, constantly trying to imagine what Alex's life was like in the orphanage. Was he well fed there? Was he being hurt? Or perhaps he had been adopted by some wealthy family a long time ago? George also worried, tossing and turning sleeplessly beside her, but he remained silent. George tried to lose himself in work. The furniture reupholstery workshop gradually turned into a large furniture factory. He had to work tirelessly, but the money was good enough. Eleanor's work was also going well, and in general, the economic situation in the country had changed a lot. They had money now. Over time, Eleanor and George could afford an apartment, their own, not a rental. And then, they bought a car. Now they went to the sea every summer, something they couldn't even dream of before. Sometimes Eleanor thought that if her son Alex had been born now, they wouldn't have even thought about putting him in an orphanage. Now they could buy Alex all the necessary medications and even perform expensive surgery. Apparently, George had the same thoughts, because one day, when Sophia was sound asleep in her room, he decided to have a serious talk. "How old is our son Alex now?" 10 years old, almost 11, Eleanor answered quietly. In all the time since visiting the orphanage, they rarely dared to talk about Alex. Their daughter Sophia didn't remember at all that she once had a brother. I'm thinking, maybe we could take him back? Yes, I think about it all the time. But I'm afraid, will he forgive us? Will he understand? And he was adopted a long time ago. So you're not against it? Relief shone on George's face. I've been thinking about it for a long time. I just didn't know how to talk to you about it. Of course, I'm not against it. I've been tormented by a wild sense of guilt all these years. Eleanor finally confessed her feelings and immediately felt relief, as if a weight had been lifted from her soul. Our daughter, Sophia. How do we tell her about this? Right away tomorrow? Let's tell her. If only we could find the words. She might react in who knows what way. She's a teenager after all. Eleanor thought. Their daughter Sophia often asked her parents for a brother or sister. But after what they had been through, Eleanor and George couldn't even think about another child. And now, at such a sensitive age, their daughter would suddenly learn about the terrible act of her mother and father. How would she react to it? It was terrifying even to imagine. Let's not tell her anything yet, Eleanor decided. First, we'll go to the orphanage, check things out, meet him, and then we'll see. They didn't postpone the trip. The very next weekend, Eleanor and George got in the car and went to the neighboring region along the same road as 10 years ago. They told Sophia they were visiting George's friend. The orphanage hadn't changed at all over the years. Perhaps there were more swings and slides in the yard. Ms. Albright, the director, was the same woman who had spoken with the bewildered couple back then, on that terrible day that had divided their lives into before and after. She recognized them immediately. "I remember you," Ms. Albright stated, examining the visitors. "You are the ones who left the boy here. That was about 10 years ago, I think. Your story is unusual. That's why I remember it. Usually children from troubled families come to us. A case like yours is rare." We'd like to take our son back." Eleanor got straight to the point. "Oh, really?" Confusion showed on Ms. Albright's face. "Back then, we were living below the poverty line," George began to explain. "We couldn't provide for the children properly, and he also needed treatment. That's why we took such a step. Now things have improved and—" And you decided that the orphanage was like a temporary holding place for the child? A bad situation. You handed him over to the state, then you changed your mind and just took him back? Ms. Albright didn't hide her irritation. You shouldn't judge us without being in our shoes, Eleanor warned. There was much more she wanted to say to this arrogant woman, but she didn't. Angering her was unwise now. They were too dependent on the orphanage director. It was foolish to turn her against them. You won't be able to take your son back. He's not with us anymore. Where? Eleanor jumped up. Where is he now? That I cannot tell you, Ms. Albright replied dryly. And now please leave my office. Why won't you tell us? Is it adoption secrecy? At least give us a hint, the father persisted, convinced that he would leave the orphanage with his son. Leave the premises, Ms. Albright repeated in an icy tone. Otherwise, I'll have to call security. First they abandon a child, then they demand him back. There was nothing to do. Eleanor and George left the office empty-handed. On the porch, Martha, the nurse, approached them. A full elderly woman with kind, sad eyes and an amazingly wrinkled face. Are you the boy's parents? She asked with sympathy, looking at the bewildered visitors. Are you the ones who left him here because you couldn't afford treatment and food? Yes, both there and here, we are those villains, George replied. Why villains? Don't listen to our director. She's awful, terrible, a bad person. Do you know anything about the boy? Eleanor looked at the nurse hopefully. Of course I do, the old woman sighed sadly. And the little boy is just like his mother. The same blue eyes, the same light hair. What a handsome boy he turned out to be. What about him? Where is he? I have no good news for you. Martha lowered her eyes. He's not alive. His heart failed 4 years ago. He didn't make it to the hospital, so the expensive medications didn't help. The ground gave way beneath Eleanor. She stumbled, almost falling. Her pale husband barely managed to hold her by the shoulders. I thought, well, it's better for you to know the truth, Martha continued. After all, you are his parents. Otherwise, you would have started searching, hired detectives, hoped for years, and then still found this out. Thank you for the truth, Eleanor managed to say. It really is better this way. How can we live now? Yes, I understand, it's hard, the old woman agreed. But you have to live. You are not to blame for anything. The little boy was sick. It would have happened even earlier in your family without treatment. And here he lived well. Everyone loved him. The boy was very kind and affectionate, and smart too. Eleanor and George were silent all the way home. Eleanor understood that Martha was right. Her son Alex was doomed from birth. But she couldn't help blaming herself for being a coward back then. Even if her son had lived less, but surrounded by loving relatives, not strangers. Eleanor understood. This guilt would now stay with her forever, and nothing could atone for it. Of course, Eleanor and George didn't tell Sophia anything. Their son remained a great secret. Even with each other, Eleanor and George never spoke about their son and his fate again. It was too scary, too difficult. But they couldn't stop thinking about him, of course. Not a day passed when Eleanor didn't remember her little one. She secretly prayed for him, lit candles in church, and constantly reproached herself for her faint-heartedness. The realization that nothing could be changed now weighed heavily. To her own surprise, Eleanor gradually got used to this life. The feeling of guilt became part of her personality, without which Eleanor no longer thought of herself. Sophia grew up and went away to study in the capital, then got a job there, settled in the big city. She was no longer nearby, which saddened her parents. But at the same time, they were proud of Sophia's success and were ready to accept her departure, as long as their girl was well. Eleanor recently retired. George was still working. The workshop in the garage turned into a large furniture factory, and Eleanor's husband was a department head there, a big man with a decent salary. He liked his work. Eleanor suspected that work allowed her husband to distract himself from sad thoughts. Eleanor finally immersed herself in housekeeping. She had worked hard all her life. There wasn't enough time for the house. But now their apartment was perfectly tidy, and the table was laden with culinary masterpieces. It turned out that caring for loved ones was a pleasant pastime, not a heavy duty, as it had seemed before. True, there weren't enough people to care for now. Only George and an undemanding cat. But Eleanor was still happy. She dreamed of grandchildren that Sophia would bring to Grandma and Grandpa for the holidays. Oh, on them, Sophia's children, Eleanor would indulge herself. Soon, very soon, little ones would appear in Eleanor's life, in addition to the boy and the little girl who had already become like family. The only thing that clouded Eleanor's measured life, besides, of course, the usual thoughts of her son Alex, was her failing health. And now Eleanor was returning from the polyclinic. She deliberately chose the route through the park. She liked it here. It was beautiful, crowded, spacious, and there were so many swings for children. This is where she would bring her grandchildren. Soon, soon. Eleanor even smiled at her dreams of grandchildren. She suddenly clearly imagined a boy and a girl, twins. A plaintive, thin voice pulled Eleanor out of her sweet dreams. A tiny boy was tugging at Eleanor's coat sleeve. He looked no older than 3 or 4. Wide blue eyes, a turned-up nose with a scattering of freckles, light curls escaping from under his hat. A real angel from a picture, only very thin. The child remarkably resembled her son Alex. Eleanor had last seen Alex when he was 1, but she had no doubt. At 3 or 4, he looked exactly like this little boy. Her heart squeezed painfully. Eleanor had to take a deep breath to compose herself. The child spoke again, and his words made Eleanor start. The boy clearly needed help. "I'm cold, I'm hungry, and Mom's still not here." The little one looked lost and scared. He looked at Eleanor with eyes full of hope. Eleanor took his hand tightly, and together they slowly walked around the park several times looking for the baby's mother. Leo, who introduced himself by name, carefully looked around, but he didn't see his mother. "Where do you live?" Eleanor tried to find out. But Leo was too young to give a precise address. From his rambling explanations, Eleanor understood that Leo, his mother, and some man had traveled a long time on a train, then gone for a walk. Leo had played on the playground, and then he discovered that his mother was gone, and now he was afraid that something had happened to her. "Let's go to the station," Eleanor decided. "Perhaps your mother has reported you missing, and they are looking for you everywhere." Eleanor, holding the little one's hand tightly, found the duty booth. The man in uniform assured her that no missing child reports had been filed today. No one had been hit by a train, and in general, the whole day had been surprisingly quiet and peaceful. "And what should be done with him now?" Eleanor asked, bewildered, gesturing towards the frightened, tired little one. "What to do? What to do?" "The children are at the police station," the officer on duty replied. Homeless children often hang out at the station, kids from troubled families, runaways from orphanages. This one certainly didn't run away from an orphanage. "Evil," Eleanor replied. The officer's indifference irritated her. Eleanor called a taxi and went to the police station with the little one. The child fell soundly asleep on the way, trustingly resting his heavy little head on her lap. Eleanor stroked the boy's light curls and wondered again at the foundling's resemblance to her son Alex. And maybe it wasn't a coincidence. Maybe fate had sent them a chance to atone for their guilt in their old age. The boy was abandoned, that was obvious. Brought from somewhere far away, left on a playground in an unfamiliar city. Eleanor didn't even condemn his parents. Who knew what situations people faced in life? She knew this firsthand. True, of course, the baby's mother had acted carelessly, leaving her son in danger. Who knows who might have found the child? Bad people, stray dogs. Perhaps the bewildered, desperate woman simply hadn't thought about it. Eleanor was sure that only extreme need and despair could have driven the boy's mother to such a step. One way or another, the baby was unwanted. Most likely, an orphanage awaited him. So maybe take him into their family, become his parents with George? Or rather, his grandmother and grandfather. George certainly wouldn't object. But of course, no one gave the boy to Eleanor. Leo was taken to the Children's Hospital for examination, after which an orphanage awaited him, and his mother was declared wanted. At home, Eleanor talked her husband's ear off about the foundling. The very next weekend, they went together to visit Leo in the hospital. Leo was sincerely happy to see familiar faces, hugged Eleanor as if she were family, and shook hands with her husband George in a businesslike manner. Leo turned out to be talkative, told his visitors about his hospital days, asked 1,000 questions about the world, shared observations about the doctors and other adults around him. Eleanor fell more and more in love with this unusually smart child, and saw that the same thing was happening with George. When it was time to part, Leo hugged them tightly and didn't want to let go. Tears welled up in the baby's eyes. "You're so good, so kind. I'll miss you, like Mrs. Gable." "Is that your grandmother?" Eleanor seized on a thin thread of hope. Perhaps there was a relative on this earth who cared about the blonde baby. "Our neighbor from the barracks," Leo replied. Eleanor sighed in disappointment. Just a neighbor. Since then, Eleanor and George often visited Leo, first in the hospital, then in the orphanage, where Leo was transferred after the examination. Eleanor repeatedly asked Ms. Albright, the head of the orphanage, to let her take the little one under her care. Eleanor imagined how good it would be for Leo in their apartment. They would surround the baby with care and love, take him for walks, feed him treats, read him interesting books. But while the investigation was ongoing, that was out of the question. And then the boy's mother was finally found. Chloe was found in a city by the sea, where she had decided to start a new life. The young orphanage graduate was enjoying her freedom and the luxurious sea landscapes. She didn't need a child. She easily left him in the park near the station. Ray, her partner, a man twice her age, an experienced father of many children, advised her to do so. Ray suggested that if she put the boy in an orphanage, his mother would then have to pay child support until he was an adult. But this way, he got lost and stayed lost. How many such lost children were there across the country? They even reported the child missing, but they staged the baby's disappearance at a station almost 1,000 kilometers away from where they had abandoned Leo. Chloe received a real sentence for abandoning a minor child in danger. She was sent to a women's colony. It was there that she wrote an official refusal of her unwanted son. Now, at least, Leo had the status of an orphan. But Ray got off with a light scare, which Eleanor found unfair, as it was he who had instigated Chloe to commit the terrible act. But for some reason, Ray was not charged with complicity in the crime. Eleanor and George didn't think long about the serious step. Both had long sincerely loved Leo and were happy to welcome him into their family. They talked about their adoption plans with Sophia. She was surprised, of course, but had nothing against a little stepbrother. She even seemed happy. However, the guardianship office refused them. "Why would you want such a young child?" The woman in horn-rimmed glasses explained patiently, looking at the visitors with pity. "Your age is not right, and neither is your health. We are not allowed to give him to you because of your age, even though you seem to have all the conditions for raising a child." Eleanor and George returned home upset that day. They were already making plans about how to set up a nursery and what clubs to enroll the smart boy in, and then this happened. And what now? How to tell Leo that they wouldn't take him home, as they had promised? And why had they given the baby hope prematurely? Why hadn't they gone to the guardianship office first? It was, of course, very foolish of them. Eleanor and George continued to visit Leo at the orphanage. They brought gifts and sweets, walked with Leo around the grounds. The little one became like family to them. How could they give him up? How could they stop thinking about him? It was impossible. "I need to talk to his mother," Eleanor once told George. "Oh, really? Why do you need to do that?" he wondered. "Maybe she will write some kind of statement saying she is giving the child specifically to us." "He is nothing to her," George reminded her. "She refused him and has no right to make any decisions regarding him." "But maybe I'll find out something else important. I want to help the boy, you understand? When I imagine that the boy will have to struggle in an orphanage all his life. I understand. My heart aches for him too. I just don't see how your meeting with his biological mother can help." "Well, I feel I need to see her." "Suit yourself." Eleanor found out which city the colony where Leo's mother was serving time was located in. It was not close. Eleanor traveled for 2 days by train to the distant town. It was her first time in such a gloomy place. Gloomy staff, gray walls, a oppressive atmosphere. It was even hard to breathe here. The silent woman in the blue camouflage uniform, after a thorough search, led the visitor to the visiting room. The room resembled a living room in an ordinary apartment: a sofa, 2 armchairs, a bedside table with a television, a carpet on the floor. Soon, the mother was brought in. It turned out to be a very young girl, looking even younger than Eleanor's daughter, thin, dark-skinned, with angry black eyes. "Who are you?" Chloe asked the visitor warily. "I don't know you." Eleanor introduced herself and told her how she had found the scared baby in the park. "So that's why I'm here, because of you?" the girl sneered. "If not me, others would have found him," Eleanor remarked fairly. "There were Roma people wandering nearby. I hoped they would take him with them. They need little ones to beg, especially since the boy has Slavic features. People give more to such children." Eleanor felt anger boiling up inside her towards this shameless girl who wished such a fate for her son. And how could such a wonderful baby like Leo have come from such an unprincipled, selfish mother? Maybe he took after his father. Outwardly, he certainly didn't resemble his mother at all. "Where is the boy's real father?" Eleanor asked. She suppressed her irritation with willpower and continued the conversation with the girl in a calm, even tone. The boy's fate now depended on this girl. It was unwise to anger her. "Father?" Chloe snorted. "He lives somewhere, got married, apparently had a daughter. Things happened quickly for him, and yet he swore love to me, asked me to come back with the boy, begged me to let him see him." "Please tell me more." Eleanor suddenly felt a spark of hope. It was unlikely, but what if the boy's father was a decent person who would be happy to have such a son and would take him from the orphanage? "What's there to tell?" Chloe grumbled and suddenly brightened up. "All right, I'll tell you everything, but not for free." "How much?" Eleanor asked. The girl thought about the amount. She clearly didn't want to sell herself short or scare the visitor away with too high a price. "5,000, I think, will be enough." Eleanor tried to hide her relief so as not to whet the girl's appetite. "All right," Eleanor agreed, as if reluctantly, took half the amount from her wallet and handed it to the girl. "The rest after." "Okay," Chloe immediately cheered up. "The story isn't original, but it's long, so, as they say, make yourself comfortable and listen." Chloe grew up in an orphanage. Her childhood was difficult: hunger, angry caregivers, humiliation, even beatings. Eleanor wondered to herself how this girl, having gone through such suffering, could deliberately condemn her own child to the same. One way or another, the girl grew up. She was given a small apartment in a crumbling barracks. It was her own place, however humble. The girl was happy about her long-awaited freedom and having her own place. True, no one called her for lunch in the dining room on the first floor anymore. She had to earn her own living, and the girl didn't like working. The young, attractive orphanage graduate quickly figured out how not to starve and not have to slave away at a job. she learned to live off her admirers, of whom there was no shortage. One day, the girl met a former classmate from the college the orphanage administration had once forced her to attend. The blue-eyed, modest blonde guy was in love with her. The girl understood this perfectly, but he didn't dare to confess. And she even deliberately amused herself, making the guy blush with unexpected phrases and requests. And then they accidentally met in the park. The guy looked much better than in college. He had matured and become more confident. It turned out he still had feelings for the girl. It was strange, but very pleasant. The girl took the guy in hand. They started dating. The guy felt absolutely happy, even proposed to the lady of his heart. But the guy had one significant drawback: strict parents who controlled their son's life. Of course, they wouldn't have been against such a daughter-in-law. And even if the wedding had taken place, the guy's parents would constantly watch the girl's every step. And then she would have had to forget about carefree parties, romantic dates, and such pleasant things. And the guy himself. Nice-looking, of course, reliable, but somehow too proper and boring. Becoming his wife meant dedicating herself to family, home, and housekeeping once and for all. But no, that was definitely not for the girl, at least not yet. So the girl refused the proposal, rudely rejected the smitten guy, and a couple of weeks later, she realized she was pregnant, and definitely by him. At first, she wanted to have a termination, but due to inexperience, she waited too long, and the hospital refused. What to do? No money, no job, and she didn't want to slave away. One of her new acquaintances advised her to give birth. "Don't miss your chance," the experienced woman instructed her. "Give birth, you'll get state benefits, and you'll shake money out of the father until the little one turns 18. The girl thought about it. Yes, the prospects were indeed good. True, the young future mother didn't imagine what a child was like. It wasn't a doll that lay where you left it. The girl realized that motherhood was a punishment, hard labor, very quickly. The boy was born healthy and calm, according to those around him. But he turned the life of his young mother into a nightmare. He constantly cried, demanded food, attention. It was unbearable. The guy initially only helped with money. The girl didn't allow him to see the baby. She couldn't explain why, just out of spite, probably. She liked feeling her power, her might. But then, when the infant completely exhausted the girl, she still needed the guy's physical help. The young father gladly spent time with the baby, changed his diapers, took him for walks outside, while the girl could rest a little. Then the guy started taking the boy for overnights. He was already living separately from his parents, so their consent or prohibition didn't matter to him. Officially, the guy was nobody to the child. In the boy's birth certificate, the girl asked for a dash in the father column to receive benefits. But in fact, it was the guy who raised the baby from 6 months to about 2.5 years. He worked remotely, so he managed to combine work and raising his son. The girl lived as she had always dreamed: entertainment, noisy companies, romantic dates, drinking that added color to gray weekdays. There was money. The state regularly paid benefits for the child, who was actually raised and fed by the guy. Admirers didn't skimp on drinks and snacks. Everything was simply wonderful. The girl considered this a reward from fate for the difficult years in the orphanage. One day, guardianship authorities appeared at the girl's apartment right in the middle of a party. It turned out the guy had decided to officially register the boy as his own. He planned to do a DNA test to confirm paternity and deprive the girl of parental rights. He believed it was dangerous for the child to be with such a mother. The girl couldn't allow this, because then goodbye benefits. She threw a huge scandal, took her son, and forbade the guy from coming near them. "Otherwise, I'll file a police report. You're nobody to him, a stranger. Let them figure out how you got the child. They'll accuse you and put you in jail," the girl raved. Older friends taught her how to deal with the child's unhappy father. "Transfer money for his support, you're obliged to, since you're the father, even if unofficial. If you have a conscience, you'll help. But I won't let you see him anymore." The guy tried to reconcile. It was clear that he had become attached to the boy and sincerely loved him, but the girl remained unapproachable. She didn't want big problems that could be expected from the guy. Leo grew up. There were far fewer problems and troubles with him. He could even be let out into the yard alone for a few hours. Let him play, get some fresh air. It was good for him. Neighbors, however, complained, saying she was a negligent mother for leaving such a little one unsupervised. But their opinion didn't interest the girl much. A little over a year passed. Leo had almost forgotten the guy. He also didn't remind her of himself anymore, though he did regularly transfer money for the baby's support. One day the girl learned from mutual acquaintances that the guy had gotten married and that the young family was expecting an addition. The girl suddenly realized that this news upset her. Her own reaction greatly surprised the girl. She hadn't thought that the guy's personal life mattered to her at all. And yet, the girl had long been sure that the guy loved her and the boy, that he was ready for anything for their sake. She could twist the guy around her finger, manipulate him, play on his feelings, and then suddenly this. Well, okay, what now? Another great love appeared in the girl's life, a shift worker, old enough to be her father, but strong, confident, knowing a thing or two about life, and with some money. With someone like that, you wouldn't be lost. True, the boy still bothered the adults. He needed to be fed, clothed, shod, and occasionally taken to the polyclinic. He asked 1,000 questions a minute, constantly demanding attention. A lot of money was spent on him. In short, the man suggested getting rid of the boy. And a suitable opportunity presented itself. The couple decided to move permanently to a city by the sea. The man had some friends or relatives there. The journey was long, long. The little boy could easily get lost somewhere along the way. The girl didn't object. Her early motherhood weighed heavily on her, and the need to care for her son irritated her. Of course, she could have given him to the guy, but then it would mean he had won. And the man also advised against it. If you remain his mother, child support debt will accumulate, and you won't be able to pay it off later. The girl didn't want such a fate for herself. That's why she didn't put the boy in an orphanage, because with official registration, all her data would remain in the database, and she would have to transfer money for the boy's support until he turned 18. No thank you. She much preferred the man's plan. Leave the boy at the station in one city, and then report him missing at a completely different station. And then no one would find any trace. How wise that decision seemed then. The girl was sure the plan would work. But in the end, things didn't turn out as they hoped. The negligent mother was found anyway. And now Chloe was here, in the colony, serving time for abandoning a minor child in danger. This, she and the man had not foreseen. And he turned out to be a scoundrel, the girl spat out venomously. That man, when they pressured us, he blamed everything on me, stayed clean himself. But never mind, I'll get out of here. I'll get revenge on that lowlife. Thank you for your frankness, Eleanor thanked her, having listened to the girl. You truly have a hard life. And yet, after all, you have an apartment. The father helped support the baby. I can't understand how you could give up such a miracle. Well, take this miracle for yourself since you're so good, the girl replied irritably. Not so good. Eleanor shook her head. I also made mistakes in my time. And they won't give me the boy. They say I'm too old to be a mother to such a little one. Well, let it be. He lives in an orphanage. I grew up there myself, and I'm fine. Eleanor said goodbye to the girl and left the building. A plan to save Leo had already formed in her head. If she understood correctly, the boy's father was a good, decent person. Eleanor knew his name, knew the city he lived in. It was City Name. She knew his approximate age and the place where the boy's father studied with his mother. Finding the man would probably not be difficult. And then she would have to act according to the circumstances. But Eleanor was absolutely sure that she needed to find the guy. Returning home, Eleanor actively began her search. She started by monitoring social media. She checked all the mother's friends and also sifted through friends of friends. There were many guys among them, but none fit the description. Then, Eleanor placed an ad in a local news group, briefly describing the situation. This step yielded an unwanted result. Eleanor started receiving calls from pranksters who thought it was very funny to pretend to be the guy and make the opponent believe a crazy story. At first, Eleanor answered every caller hopefully. It seemed to her that the boy's father had finally been found, and therefore the boy was saved. But soon, Eleanor was scolding herself for the rash act. Calls came at the most inconvenient times, interrupted important matters, made her nervous and worried. In despair, Eleanor shared the problem with Sophia when she called to ask how her parents were doing. "Mom, why didn't you consult me?" Sophia reproached her. "I didn't want to distract you. You have so many things to do. I thought I could handle it myself." Delete the ad before they completely wear you out with calls. "We need to hire a private detective. I'll take care of it." That's probably very expensive, isn't it? Not as much as you think, but it's reliable. But there was no need to turn to detectives because the guy called himself. That same evening, Eleanor had just deleted the ad when another call came in. "I'm calling about your message in our city's news chat," a quiet male voice said on the phone. Eleanor thought it was someone calling to amuse themselves again. She had gotten used to it over the past few days, and so she answered dryly and reservedly. "I'm listening carefully." "I think you're talking about my son. My name is Daniel's name, his is Leo's name. The child's mother didn't let us see each other. They disappeared from the city not long ago, so everything seems to fit." "What is the boy's mother's name?" Eleanor had a control question ready that filtered out the curious and the pranksters. "Her name is Chloe's name. Please tell me quickly, is the boy all right?" "It seems it really is you," Eleanor concluded. "Answer a few more questions so I can be sure. You know, I've had a lot of pranksters calling me about this lately. I even had to delete the ad. Of course, I myself want to understand if this is my boy." "All right. What does the baby look like? How old is he now? Describe my son's appearance." "The boy is almost 4 years old. He has big blue eyes, light wavy hair, a turned-up nose. He's unusually smart for his age, picks everything up quickly, loves strawberry ice cream, adores animals, and constantly asks questions. He's very curious, and he's also quite—" "I understand," Eleanor smiled. "You know your son perfectly, and it seems you really love him. So where's the boy now? I understand his mother isn't with him?" "The boy is all right. He really needs help right now," Eleanor replied. "Something unpleasant happened to him, it's even scary. And the child is now in a shelter. He's a wonderful boy. I wanted to take him in myself, but the guardianship office didn't approve. They said I'm too old for adoption, and I really wanted to help him, so I found you." "You can't even imagine how grateful I am to you." The guy's voice trembled with emotion. "I'm coming to your city very soon." "Write down my address," Eleanor offered. "I think we need to meet and talk about a lot. Besides, it would be good if we went to the boy together. He has probably forgotten you, of course. He was just a baby when you were taking care of him. But he's gotten used to me. He trusts me. Let's go to the boy together." "Wow!" The guy was surprised. "So you even know such details? I really did take care of the child myself for about 6 months. His mother wasn't interested in him. I went to his mother. I talked to her. Otherwise, I wouldn't have found you." Eleanor really wanted to see the guy before he went to see the boy. It was important for her to make sure he was a reliable, decent person with whom the boy would be well off. So she went to meet the man at the station. Eleanor immediately recognized the guy. The young man remarkably resembled the boy. Daniel didn't come alone. A little girl sat in his arms. She looked no older than a year. Probably the boy's little sister. As blue-eyed and blonde as her brother. A pretty young woman was walking quickly beside the man, trying to keep up with her husband. Eleanor hurried towards this beautiful family. Noticing the young people from a distance, she understood. The boy would soon be in good hands. If only they would give him to his father. With him, the boy would be happy. What luck that they were found. Thank you so much for not abandoning our son, for finding us. Daniel looked at Eleanor and smiled widely. And then he introduced his charming companions. This is my wife, Sarah, and the little one is named Lily. She's our daughter. But they didn't go to the orphanage right away. They had to wait for visiting hours. Eleanor helped the family settle in a local hotel. She offered them to stay with her. George and she herself would have been happy to have such wonderful company, but Daniel's wife flatly refused to inconvenience the hosts. You've done so much for our family, Sarah said to Eleanor. I always dreamed we'd have many children, and definitely an older boy. It seems that wish will soon come true. You'll really like the boy, Eleanor smiled, feeling warmth spread in her chest. He's just a wonderful little one. How I've missed him all this time, Daniel confessed. Finally, it was time for visits. The whole company, led by Eleanor, sat in the orphanage lobby and waited for Leo to be brought out. The staff was already aware of the situation. Some couldn't hold back tears, learning that the baby had found a loving father ready to take him into his family. All that remained was the paperwork. To take Leo back, Daniel needed to gather a whole pile of papers. But they could meet him now. Just don't rush to hug him right away, Eleanor instructed. Or he might get scared. He probably doesn't remember you. I understand, Daniel nodded. Of course I understand that my son has forgotten me. He was just a baby when his mother took him and forbade us from seeing each other. And yet, why didn't you fight for the child through court? Eleanor asked the question that interested her. After all, it was dangerous for him to stay with his mother. I tried, Daniel replied, lowering his eyes sadly. But I was essentially a stranger to him. And to do a DNA test, you need the consent of the boy's legal representative, which is his mother. As you understand, she, of course, didn't give consent. She needed the boy as a source of income. Exactly, added Daniel's wife, Sarah. There are many mothers like that now, who live on benefits. And then a rich man appeared, and the realization dawned. There's a man, the need for benefits disappeared, and the child was a hindrance. Well, that's the result. It's good that everything turned out so well. It could have been much worse. It's terrifying even to imagine the dangers that threatened the baby who was abandoned in an unfamiliar city, in a park near the station. The young woman's voice trembled. Tears welled up in her eyes, which she tried her best to hold back. Obviously, she took the situation to heart. Soon, she would be a wonderful mother to the baby, loving, caring, understanding. You are the boy's guardian angel, Daniel smiled, looking at Eleanor. I have a child myself. His wife stroked her daughter Lily's hair, who had fallen soundly asleep on her mother's lap while waiting for her older brother. And I just don't understand how you can do that to a baby. Eleanor shook her head silently. She completely agreed with the young woman. Eleanor had often tried to find excuses for the boy's mother, a poor orphanage girl who hadn't received parental love and care in her time. But her imagination wasn't enough. Perhaps there were simply certain types of people, selfish, callous, unprincipled, and there was nothing you could do about it. Leo was very lucky that Daniel and his wife were now in his life. There couldn't be better parents for the smart boy. The door to the lobby finally opened. The adults turned their heads towards it as if on command. Standing at the threshold was the caregiver, an elderly, slightly plump woman in a white coat. She smiled kindly at those present and shook hands with everyone. The caregiver was holding the hand of a little boy with huge blue eyes. Leo had been prepared for this meeting. He smiled affectionately at Eleanor and looked with interest at the people she had brought with her to the orphanage. Well, these are the guests I told you about, the caregiver said to the child. Go on, meet them. Leo ran up to the adults and looked cheerfully at the young couple. They smiled, looking at the charming boy. "So you are my new friends?" Leo asked seriously. "It's great that you finally came. I've been waiting for you so much." At this, Daniel and his wife, despite Eleanor's and the orphanage staff's warning, couldn't hold back their emotions. They hugged Leo from both sides, enclosing him in a cocoon of caring hands. Leo stood there, blinking in surprise and smiling. Then, when the emotions subsided a little, a most fascinating conversation began. Leo, as was his custom, bombarded his visitors with questions. He was interested in his future, asked about the city he would soon move to. It was important for him to know what his room would be like. And Leo also declared that he was simply fascinated by the little girl and offered his help to Daniel and his wife in raising her. He importantly stated that he already had experience. In the orphanage, only he knew how to play properly with the youngest children. The little one was also clearly taken with the cheerful, energetic boy. She smiled at Leo with a toothless grin and reached out her chubby little hands to him. The 2 hours allotted for the visit flew by unnoticed. Eleanor's heart sang at the sight of this wonderful picture. Everything turned out even better than if she had been allowed to take Leo from the orphanage. Yes, she had become very attached to the baby, but now he would have young parents and a little sister. And most importantly, his biological father. No one can replace a biological relative. The city was preparing for the New Year holidays. The streets were decorated with garlands and thematic life-size figures. Shop windows beckoned with announcements of winter sales. Eleanor decided not to take a taxi, but to walk to Daniel's house. Her bags weren't heavy. She had packed lightly, just for a couple of days. She arrived. The gifts for all members of the wonderful family were pleasantly heavy in her hands. With what pleasure she had chosen them all. After that first meeting at the orphanage, Leo didn't stay long within the walls of the state institution. Knowing Daniel's unusual story, everyone was accommodating. The administration, the guardianship authorities, and the orphanage staff. The DNA test was ready in the shortest possible time and confirmed the obvious. Leo was indeed Daniel's son. The other documents were also gathered quickly. Then a psychologist worked with Leo, explaining that the baby would now live in a family, that Daniel and his wife were his parents. Leo quickly accepted Daniel as his father, but he called his wife Auntie for a long time, although he became attached to her with all his heart. The young woman gave Leo a lot of attention, love, and affection. He literally blossomed with her, became calmer and more confident. But still, the baby still remembered his biological mother and loved her, despite everything. The young woman didn't rush the child. She was understanding of his choice. And just recently, a real pre-New Year miracle happened. Leo finally addressed the young woman with the long-awaited word, Mom. "It made me feel so warm, so light," she shared her joy with Eleanor. They now often talked on the phone. Of course, Eleanor kept in touch with these nice people. Leo brought them together, connected them with an invisible thread. The elderly woman was grateful to fate for meeting Daniel and his wife. Now she had real friends in her life. Yes, they became friends, despite the considerable age difference. It was easy and fun for them together. Eleanor regretted that the boy's family lived so far away, in another city. And Daniel and Sarah, it seemed, missed her too, because they constantly invited her to visit. And so Eleanor finally got ready, bought gifts, got on a train, and arrived. She wouldn't stay for the holiday itself. She would go back home. Sophia had promised to visit her parents for New Year and hinted that she wouldn't be alone. She would probably finally introduce her fiancé to them. And then grandchildren wouldn't be far off. Soon, very soon, little ones would appear in Eleanor's life, in addition to the boy and the little girl who had already become like family. The snow crunched loudly underfoot and sparkled beautifully in the light of the street lamps. Here was the right house. They were waiting for her there. Leo would rush to hug her from the doorway and, of course, immediately bombard her with questions. He would probably ask about the train, about the journey. They met Eleanor warmly. A set table was waiting in the living room. The aromas of delicious baking came from the kitchen. The evening was warm, heartfelt, and cheerful. Eleanor enjoyed talking with Daniel and his wife, listening to new cheerful stories about the little ones. And yes, life with such tiny ones simply couldn't be boring. The young parents looked a little tired, but very happy. Our family became complete thanks to the boy, Sarah confessed. With his arrival, I realized that this is exactly the kind of boy we were missing. Daniel looked at his wife with tenderness and love. It was obvious that he was grateful to her for her attitude towards his son. Yes, the man was truly lucky. People like his wife are rare after all. And then Eleanor played with Leo and Lily, built towers out of blocks, had a tea party for dolls, swung the children on the indoor swing for a long time, enjoying their ringing laughter. And before bed, she read the little ones a fairy tale. Both listened to every word with interest, even the tiny girl. She was at a very imitative age now, trying to copy everything her brother did, like a little monkey. Then Eleanor lay on the sofa in the guest room assigned to her and smiled. The household members, tired from the day's activities and impressions, were asleep. The wall clock ticked in the apartment. Sleepy, quiet, peaceful. Eleanor was used to being tormented by thoughts of her son Alex before bed. She tried to imagine his life in the orphanage, without parental love and affection, wondered if the caregivers or other children had hurt her son. All this was terribly burdensome and prevented her from being happy. And now, for some reason, it felt easier. Memories of the terrible mistake no longer caused such emotional torment. Leo had somehow miraculously healed the old wounds. No, Eleanor didn't absolve herself of guilt. Her heart still ached for her son Alex, who had such a difficult fate, a poor, abandoned, sick boy. But Eleanor finally decided to tell Sophia everything. She, of course, was shocked. For some time, Sophia simply blinked silently and tried to catch her breath. So stunned was she by the suddenly revealed secret. But Sophia didn't turn away from her parents, as Eleanor had imagined all these years. On the contrary, she pitied them, accepted this terrible choice, even supported them. "How do you live with such a heavy burden on your souls?" Sophia whispered, hugging her mother and father. "But you were young, lost, and scared, and no one supported you. My poor dears." Yes, the tragedy with her son would forever remain with Eleanor. But now life was much easier. She had a chance to save a child who was so remarkably like her son, and she did it. Now Leo was in a loving family, and joy and peace reigned in Eleanor's soul.